out of all the unfortunate things to happen in ReZero, I bet you never expected Subaru to have yet another one-on-one against the mangled undead corpse of a former opponent. But that's exactly what happened as he was searching for Beatrice. It was a whole battle with two previously defeated enemies that almost cost Subaru his life. A battle that ended with a scientific bang that would have made Senku proud. So let's take a look at that amongst some other details as we go through the cut content for this very emotional episode. Let's begin. Episode 49, Choose Me, covering chapters 6 and 7 from volume 15 of the light novel. After Amelia arrived at the Icy Spire, it shattered into particles of mana because the job intended for it had already been completed. The structure itself was no longer needed since the snowstorm had been created with a fair level of sufficiency. As we know, this was all because of the spell that Roswaal had embedded into the crystal before his fight. It was a magic formula that rivaled in complexity and magical density to the one in the tomb. There was even the remnants of a defensive barrier that would have scorched any person who attempted to approach it. But the formula that constituted those defenses had already been unraveled, mainly due to Puck's intervention. So all that was left was for Amelia to just see everything through. Now, the reason Ryuzu was so upset by Shima taking this duty upon herself was mostly due to a feeling of guilt from the way she treated her. Remember, Shima had been abandoned by the other Ryuzus for breaking the rules and entering the tomb. She was removed as an administrator and forced to spend the last 10 years with no one else other than Garfield. So Ryuzu didn't think it was fair for Shima to be the one to bear this responsibility. But just like how Garfield came to understand the role that he had to play, so too did Shima come to understand hers. When everything was said and done, neither Amelia nor anyone else really understood what had happened. All Amelia knew was that she'd just bore witness to a very pivotal moment. It was after this that she went to go find Ram and Roswaal. As I mentioned last video, the only reason Ram was still alive here was due to Roswaal's subconscious compulsion to help her. The constant flow of mana he was providing her with allowed her to maintain whatever weak hold on life she currently had left. It's a course of action that I explained a bit more in my most recent video. So if you want to see Roswaal's true power or the reason behind why he does this, then feel free to check that out next. But anyway, with that being everything that happened at Sanctuary, we can now go back to the events at the mansion. During the flashback of how Beatrice inherited the Forbidden Archives, there was a quick mention of how it was likely that Roswaal's gate had been destroyed in his battle with Hector. Echidna believed he probably wouldn't ever be able to showcase his prowess with magic again. But even without his innate magical talent, Echidna still believed that he could be helpful to Beatrice. After the first Roswaal had passed away just prior to the age of 30, the connection Beatrice shared with him began to fade with every new Roswaal that took his place. Though they all shared the same name and revered the same mother, there was only one Roswaal whom Beatrice considered to be special. Everyone else that came after was nothing more than an empty fake, uninspired copies that she couldn't even bother to associate with. So, as the centuries went on with Beatrice doing as she was told, there was one event in particular that brought some life back to her. A reunion with a great spirit whose origins were identical to hers. But what set these two spirits apart was that Puck wasn't bound to the will of his creator. No, instead he had started a new life, one that was completely different from the life he had the last time she saw him. This was a life that Beatrice herself could only dream of. Not because he was doing what he wanted with the one he loved, but rather because he was actually fulfilling his duty. Puck was doing the very thing that Beatrice couldn't. He was following through with his end of a sacred pact, thus the reason for Beatrice's envy. When the day finally came for Subaru to make his unexpected appearance, we learned that he'd been able to find Beatrice's passage so easily due to his affinity for dark magic. His innate magical trait had made him highly compatible with her. So what he mistook for his own intuition was actually him sensing a connection to Beatrice. That's why he'd been able to find the archive time and time again. Now, despite Subaru being such an unappealing person to her, the more she had come to know him, the more fond of him she became. It wasn't that he was a particularly special individual, but he was the first one to come to the archive for her. I mean, all the others who had come before him either sought the power she possessed or the knowledge she was guarding. But Subaru was the first one who actually came to see the girl, not the spirit. This much became evident when Subaru had come to ask her about curses. So it was during this time that things actually weren't too bad for her. Beatrice was even considering being a little bit nicer to him. But that all changed when Subaru went to the capital and didn't return. At least not when he was supposed to. The day that he did, though, The news that came with him was what allowed her to send him away in accordance with Roswell's plan. It was at this point that Beatrice had grown accustomed to being left behind. So adding yet another person to that list wasn't going to make much of a difference. On the night that Beatrice thought everything was finally going to end, the boy she'd sent away had returned one more time to poke at the feelings she'd been trying to hide from. I mean, here she was so close to breaking free from her centuries of loneliness. Yet here was this boy trying to revitalize a hope she'd thrown away such a very long time ago. It was a moment that caused Beatrice to think that perhaps there was a different future. Perhaps she could actually get revenge on the cruel fate she'd been exposed to. The only thing she needed to do was simply reach out and grab it. That was all it took to break the 400-year-old obsession that led her here. Right as those hopes were about to be met, though, Subaru himself crushed them with his very blunt answer to her question, leading to the first time he'd been flung from the archives. It was after this that he was ejected 4 more times before succeeding to stay on the 5th. And while the ensuing conversation was pretty much taken word for word, where the novel starts to go into more detail is with the distortion of the archive itself. When the whole world around Subaru started to become hazy, he quickly fell to his knees as he found that he wasn't able to stand anymore. Something unrelated to anemia or fatigue was causing his body to grow weaker. Something that was quite clearly related to the domain that he was standing in. Eventually, Subaru came to believe that it was because of Beatrice. Because the state of the archive was directly related to her mental state, it was likely falling apart because her weakened mind couldn't maintain it. Whatever it was, though, the only place that remained unaffected was the area Beatrice was sitting in. Everything else was being torn apart by cracks in space that Subaru had only ever seen once before. Now, here's where things start to get a little bit different. After Subaru had fallen into the void and awoken outside the mansion, the ensuing search for Beatrice had taken quite the dark turn. The first thing to note was the presence of a dense black miasma. There was this shadow-like cloak that seemed to envelop Subaru's body and shield him as he ran through the fire. A shroud of darkness that Subaru himself wasn't even aware of. We don't know exactly what it was or how it got there, but it's likely Subaru wouldn't have made it as far as he did without it. That said, the search itself didn't go as smoothly as we saw in the anime. Well, it was going fine up until Subaru suddenly heard a strange dragging sound coming from the distance. Considering that all the demon beasts had already fled, Subaru couldn't even imagine what it was that was making the sound. But he didn't have to wonder for long, since what emerged from the flames was a figure dressed in black. A woman fated to confront Subaru one last time. As soon as he saw the black blade that she was holding, Subaru immediately knew that this was Elsa, or at least what was left of her. It was pretty obvious that the person that was Elsa no longer inhabited this body. The way it dragged itself across the burning ground showed there was neither a soul nor any sign of life. There was only this hollow darkness that seemed to emanate from the body's empty gaze. Given that its lower half had been completely crushed, Subaru believed that this was the incarnation of Elsa's obsession. Her limitless bloodlust given physical form from beyond the grave. While you could chalk this up to an abnormal level of vitality, it was probably more accurate to simply call it a curse. There was no peace in the afterlife for a being who lived to cause so much pain. Anyway, Subaru didn't have time to deal with the corpse in front of him. Luckily, since it was crawling at a relatively slow pace, all he had to do to avoid it was go the opposite direction. The instant he turned his back, though, the corpse lunged itself forward in a series of attacks that Subaru barely managed to avoid. The only reason he was spared from the initial slash of it was because the body's mangled legs had prevented it from getting close enough. So Subaru kicked away the hand carrying the blade, then ran towards the floor above. The idea was that Elsa wouldn't be able to follow given her lack of functional legs. But to Subaru's surprise, a couple flights of stairs only worked to slow her down a bit. So Subaru had no choice but to go all the way up to the 3rd floor. As he was passing the study that Otto and Petra had escaped from, a familiar set of claws quickly slashed out towards him from behind a wall of fire. The creature it had come from was covered with numerous burns, but that didn't stop Subaru from recognizing it as the Guilty Row. It was definitely much weaker since it was struggling to even breathe, but it was certainly strong enough to still kill him. Since it was probably still following the orders of its master, that meant that Subaru needed to get out of there as fast as possible. I mean, getting stuck between a Shadow Lion and an undead Elsa was definitely not a position he wanted to be in. So, as this demon beast went in for an attack, Subaru evaded it in a roll-like dodge that placed him behind it, making it so that the Guilty Row was now between himself and the undead that was chasing him. Because there was now this obstacle directly in the way of Elsa's target, she unexpectedly began to dismember it as if it were an enemy. First, she cut off one of its legs. Then, after the guilty Rao tried to retaliate with its tail, she simply dodged, then cut that off next. Though there wasn't any logical reason for her to do so, it was clear that nothing was going to stop Elsa from getting to the target that she was hunting. Subaru just got lucky that the guilty Rao happened to make for a nice temporary roadblock. Seeing as how this was his golden opportunity, Subaru went to open the last remaining door in the mansion. But what he found was a doorway to nothing, much like how we saw in the anime. As he could hear the sound of Elsa's one-sided fight coming to its end, Subaru knew he had to think quick if he was going to make it out of this. So that's when he remembered the final door remaining in the basement. Since this was actually an underground escape tunnel, Subaru couldn't help but think that Beatrice may have planned it this way. You see, whether he did or didn't end up opening all the doors, every path would have eventually led him to this escape tunnel. So perhaps Beatrice had been trying to save him this entire time. What she probably didn't realize though was that the escape tunnel had already turned into this ticking time bomb, something that I'll explain a little bit later. But what this meant was that Subaru was now surrounded on both sides. To his front was an explosion just waiting to happen, and behind him was an undead slowly approaching its target. There was absolutely nowhere left for Subaru to run now. Even while being in this perilous situation though, Subaru wasn't the least bit anxious to know the outcome. Because he knew that Beatrice was the one in charge of the result here, he was able to be at ease as he opened the door. Now, when the undead Elsa rolled down the stairs and sensed its target right at the door ahead of her, she immediately charged forward without any regard for the flames surrounding her. In one hand was the blood-soaked blade she was known for, and the other carried the heart of the demon beast she'd just slayed, all of which was becoming more and more scorched as she made her way deeper into the flames. The closer the undead got to the door at the end of the passage, the more it was able to make out a stagnant black miasma coming from it. This must have been where the undead believed its target was, because the instant it got close enough to attack, it sliced the door to tiny bits and pieces. As soon as the remains of it fell to the ground, both white and black smoke collided with each other in a matter of seconds. The oxygen from the underground passage was now quickly entering the room that was just recently so deprived of it, with the entire passageway now caught in this reaction of incomplete combustion. The end result was the scientific phenomenon known as a backdraft, a relentless explosion that instantly incinerated the undead corpse that had caused it, leaving nothing behind but a smoldering pile of ash. Now, the first thing Beatrice told Subaru was how he wasted the opportunity she'd given him. It turns out that she was in fact trying to lead him to the escape tunnel, but now that there wasn't a single door left to connect the passage to, both were stranded within the archive, bringing us to the emotional conversation from the anime. There really isn't too much to say when it comes to this. The anime did a fantastic job adapting it just as they normally do with every emotional climax. I mean, most of it was pretty much taken word for word. To sum things up though, rather than try to understand the pain the past 400 years had caused her, Subaru was instead offering Beatrice hope. A hope that could start to heal whatever wounds had been carved into her from her centuries of loneliness. This was the last thing Beatrice believed before dropping the tome and reaching out to grab the new future that awaited her. Anyway, that's pretty much it for this episode. So I hope you enjoyed this little horror story about zombie Elsa. It would have been pretty cool to see in the anime, but I'm sure there were more important things that we needed to see instead. But yeah, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So until next time, ciao!